A millionaire handed his assistant full control, convinced he was securing his legacy. But when his loyal wife walked back in on Monday, arm in arm with a rival firm CEO, the ground beneath him shifted. What she brought with her wasn't just a deal, it was a reckoning that would leave him with nothing. The city pulsed beneath the towering skyline, lights flickering like a living organism in constant motion. Inside the 34th floor of a sleek glass office building, Daniel Remington stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, swirling a glass of scotch with idle confidence. The golden liquid mirrored the power he believed he'd mastered, reflecting the life he had so meticulously built, one of status, control, and unapologetic ambition. His eyes scanned the cityscape like a man surveying his kingdom, and for a moment, he allowed himself to indulge in the belief that he had finally perfected his life. Behind him, his office buzzed with silent efficiency, assistants typing, meetings being scheduled, decisions being executed, all under his direction. Everything was in place. Everything, in his mind, was exactly as it should be. At the center of this calculated empire stood Olivia Hart, his assistant of just under 2 years. Younger, poised, sharp as a blade honed by ambition, Olivia had slowly risen from a quiet presence to a commanding force in Daniel's professional life. Where others hesitated, she acted. Where others questioned, she calculated. Daniel admired that, perhaps a little too much. He had come to rely on her insight, her precision, her ability to get things done before he even voiced the need. Slowly, subtly, he began to lean on her in ways that went far beyond mere delegation. Olivia's influence had seeped into every corner of his operations, until the line between assistant and executive began to blur. It was in this very office, with the city burning gold in the afternoon light, that Daniel made what he believed would be the most strategic move of his career. The ink dried quickly on the transfer documents, and with a stroke of his pen, he officially granted Olivia full control of Remington Holdings' executive operations. The board had been hesitant, but Daniel had insisted. "I know what I'm doing," he'd said, voice steady, a half-smile tugging at his lips. "She sees the future of this company better than any of you." When the papers were signed, Olivia didn't gloat. She simply nodded, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something just beneath the surface. Not pride, not gratitude. Something colder, something quieter. Daniel noticed it, but dismissed it just as quickly. He didn't like overanalyzing things that made him feel uncomfortable. That same day, across town in the quiet hum of their modern mansion, Evelyn Remington stood at the doorway of Daniel's home office, watching him pack the last of his things into a leather briefcase. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, remnants of years spent planning their life together. The shelves, once lined with photographs of the two of them, had been slowly stripped down over time. Only one remained, tucked beside a stack of business journals, a wedding photo. Evelyn noticed it, and for a brief second, her hand hovered near it, unsure whether to take it or leave it behind. Daniel looked up, adjusting the cufflinks she had given him years ago on his birthday. "You don't need to worry about the company anymore, Evelyn," he said casually, not even glancing at her. "Olivia's taking over executive responsibilities. It'll be smoother this way." Evelyn's eyes narrowed slightly. She didn't argue. She hadn't argued in months. Not since she saw the shift happening. The way Daniel's calls became shorter, his dinners later, his compliments rarer. The moment Olivia Hart stepped into the office, something had changed. It wasn't just professional, it was personal. Evelyn had always known when something was slipping away, even if the world around her chose not to see it. "And what am I supposed to do now?" she asked softly, her voice calm, composed, but laced with something far more piercing than anger, disappointment. Daniel finally met her eyes, but only for a second. "You'll be free to focus on whatever you want. Travel, right, relax. You've earned that much, haven't you?" She didn't respond. Instead, she turned to leave, her heels echoing against the marble floor. At the doorway, she paused and glanced over her shoulder. "Just remember something, Daniel," she said without raising her voice. "Power feels satisfying until you realize who's really watching you hold it." It was a strange thing to say. Daniel scoffed quietly, brushing it off like dust on his tailored jacket. Evelyn was always dramatic when emotional. She'd settle down in a few weeks. She always did. Later that evening, Olivia entered the executive suite, now hers, and stood silently, taking in the space. Her fingers trailed over the polished surface of the desk, the same desk where Daniel had built his empire. A small smile crept onto her lips, just enough to flicker and then vanish. She sat down in the chair, opened the drawer, and removed a small box from her purse. Inside it, a sleek brass nameplate, Olivia Hart, Chief Operating Officer. She placed it on the desk, straightened it with deliberate care, and leaned back. Power didn't need grand announcements. Sometimes, it settled quietly, like mist creeping into a room before anyone noticed the door was left open. Meanwhile, Evelyn wandered through the house alone. The once warm halls now echoed with silence. She stopped in the kitchen, poured herself a glass of wine, and stared at the empty space where they used to sit together at night. She hadn't cried, not even when she saw Daniel's growing absence in his presence. She had always been stronger than that, but strength didn't make the loneliness easier. That night, as Daniel dined with Olivia in a private lounge reserved for executives, Evelyn sat outside on the patio, wrapped in a wool shawl, her eyes fixed on the night sky. The stars offered no comfort, only clarity. She could feel the shift in her bones, as if the universe had already moved the pieces into position for something far greater than Daniel could ever see coming. Olivia toasted to the next chapter, her eyes meeting Daniel's across the candlelit table. "You've made the right decision," she said, voice smooth like silk over glass. "You'll see everything align faster than you expected." Daniel raised his glass, unaware of the layers beneath her words. He believed he had everything under control, that power, assistant, and prestige were all his, molded exactly to his liking. He didn't see the subtle cracks forming under the surface. He didn't notice how Olivia's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. And far across town, Evelyn reached for her phone. She opened her contact list and hovered her finger over a name she hadn't dialed in years. Her pulse steady, her resolve cold and measured. She pressed call. "Hello," came a voice from the other end. "It's Evelyn," she said simply. "I think it's time we talk." And with that, the first domino quietly fell. If you were in Evelyn's shoes, would you have walked away quietly or come back stronger like she did? Tell us in the comments what you would have done. And while you're at it, rate this story from 0 to 10 and hit that like button to help more people discover this incredible journey. Don't forget to subscribe. You'll want to see how this story ends. The sun poured through the glass walls of the Remington Holdings headquarters, illuminating the smooth marble floors and casting long reflections across the polished steel decor. Olivia Hart stepped out of the elevator with effortless poise, her heels clicking with precision against the floor, the sound echoing through the hall like a metronome marking the rhythm of her ascent. The front desk assistant nodded at her with a mix of admiration and subtle fear. She didn't return the gesture. She was no longer an assistant. She was now the one people answered to, the one they watched carefully, whispered about behind closed doors, and obeyed without question. Her promotion hadn't just shifted responsibilities. It had tilted the balance of power in the entire company. Employees noticed the change immediately. Office dynamics shifted overnight. Where Evelyn Remington once brought warmth and diplomacy to the executive suite, Olivia brought sharpness and control. Meetings began to start earlier. Reports were requested with tighter deadlines. Memos circulated with her initials on every corner, and departments scrambled to meet new expectations. People who had once dismissed Olivia as just the assistant now straightened their posture when she passed, recalibrating their tone when they spoke, careful not to appear resistant. Olivia's energy filled the halls like perfume, subtle at first, but lingering long after she was gone. Daniel observed her with pride, watching her navigate the corridors of influence like a seasoned strategist. He praised her openly in board meetings, boasting about her intuitive leadership and fresh perspective. More than once, he remarked, half-jokingly, that Olivia was the best decision he'd made for the company. "She gets it," he'd say to anyone who questioned her rapid ascent. "She understands vision. She doesn't hesitate." No one dared challenge him directly, but in whispers, low enough not to echo past the conference room walls, some murmured about the risks of putting so much authority in someone so new to executive leadership. Daniel didn't care. He saw Olivia as the future, efficient, driven, and most importantly, loyal, or so he thought. It wasn't just the company she was taking over. Slowly, Olivia began to occupy the spaces that Evelyn had left behind, subtle at first, but undeniable. The private dinners once reserved for Daniel and Evelyn were now shared between him and Olivia, often at high-end restaurants where heads turned as they entered. Her wardrobe evolved, no longer the sleek, functional attire of an assistant, but designer suits, expensive watches, subtle hints of luxury that aligned with her new status. Daniel noticed, and he approved. "You look like power," he told her one evening before a client gala. She smiled, accepting the compliment without modesty. Behind the scenes, Olivia's influence grew deeper. She began to question long-standing processes, reassign department heads, and initiate reviews on executive expenses. Some praised her reforms. Others called her disruptive. But what couldn't be denied was that she was reshaping the company in her image. One policy, one decision, one firing at a time. Within weeks, 2 senior executives who had worked under Evelyn's influence were replaced. Olivia presented it as strategic restructuring, but everyone knew what it was, a purge. The message was clear. There was a new order now, and it didn't include remnants of Evelyn's era. Daniel noticed the growing silence from some of his longtime colleagues, but assumed it was just resistance to change. He wasn't concerned. To him, their discomfort only confirmed Olivia's strength. One afternoon, during a casual meeting, he looked across the table at her as she dissected a logistics report and said, "You're not just executing ideas anymore. You're building something entirely new." Olivia glanced up from the paper, her expression unreadable. "That's the point," she replied, then returned to her notes. There was something in the way she said it that lingered in his thoughts for hours afterward, but he brushed it off. He had always admired assertiveness. The turning point came quietly, like most critical moments in corporate warfare. Olivia began attending meetings that Daniel used to lead alone. Investors and partners started deferring questions to her instead of him. She spoke with conviction, her numbers always precise, her forecasts bold yet compelling. Daniel noticed it, but interpreted it as a sign of her excellence. He believed they were working in tandem, not realizing the subtle shift occurring. Olivia was no longer following his lead. She was leading, and he was following, whether he noticed it or not. One evening, after a particularly long meeting with international partners, Daniel walked into his office only to find the photo of Evelyn missing from the bookshelf. He frowned, scanning the room. The shelf had been rearranged. Olivia had replaced the photo with a new set of corporate accolades, framed press clippings, awards, and a sleek metal sculpture commemorating her promotion. He stared at it for a moment, fingers brushing the space where the photo had once stood. A strange feeling tightened in his chest. Not quite sadness, not quite regret. Just a quiet sense that something irreplaceable had been erased. When he brought it up casually to Olivia the next day, she responded with a smile. "I thought we were moving forward. I wanted your space to reflect that." Daniel nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. He didn't ask for the photo back. Meanwhile, Olivia began holding private strategy sessions with department heads, without Daniel. She presented them as streamlining the chain of communication, but everyone knew what it meant. She was testing her reach, pushing boundaries. In these meetings, she dropped subtle comments about Daniel's focus, his emotional decisions, his reluctance to let go of old structures. People listened. Not all agreed, but the seed was planted. Loyalty began to shift, not because Daniel had failed, but because Olivia's presence demanded attention. She offered a new narrative, a new vision, and in corporate environments, people gravitate toward momentum. Even outside the office, Olivia's presence became dominant. She joined Daniel at social events, business dinners, industry panels. Reporters began to refer to her as the woman behind the empire, and articles speculated whether Daniel was grooming her to eventually succeed him completely. Some whispered that she was already running the show. Daniel laughed when he read such comments. "Let them talk," he said to Olivia over drinks one night. "They don't know how close we are." She looked at him, a faint smile curving her lips. "No," she said softly, raising her glass. "They really don't." At home, Daniel's relationship with Evelyn had become nothing more than a memory preserved in the quiet rooms she once filled. The house felt different now, colder, sharper. The warmth that Evelyn had infused into their life was gone, replaced by silence and the occasional echo of his own footsteps. He buried himself in work, certain that success was the only comfort he needed. But Evelyn hadn't disappeared into the shadows. Across the city, in a quiet cafe tucked between old brick buildings, she sat across from an old acquaintance, a man with silver-streaked hair, sharp eyes, and a calm demeanor. His name was Marcus Hale, a strategic consultant who had once worked closely with Remington Holdings before Daniel phased him out in favor of younger blood. Evelyn hadn't spoken to him in years, but when she did, he answered on the first ring. "I want to understand a few things," she said, stirring her coffee slowly, "about what Daniel's been doing and what he's overlooked." Marcus leaned back, intrigued. "You're not just curious," he said after a moment. "You're planning something." Evelyn didn't deny it. "Let's just say I'm done watching." And while Daniel believed he had stepped into the future with Olivia by his side, he remained blissfully unaware that the past he had discarded was quietly laying the foundation for a reckoning he never saw coming. The late afternoon sun filtered through the narrow windows of the small apartment Evelyn Remington now called home. It was nothing like the grand estate she had once designed down to every last detail. No spiral staircase, no manicured gardens, no marble-floored foyer echoing with distant footsteps. Here, the floors creaked, the walls were painted in dull beige, and the furniture was minimal, functional, forgettable. But Evelyn didn't care. This space was hers now, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like she was living in someone else's world. She brewed a pot of tea in a chipped ceramic kettle, the whistle piercing through the quiet as she stared out the window toward the street below. The sound of a passing bus, a barking dog, a child laughing. These noises were raw, ordinary, and oddly comforting. She had been invisible in her own life for far too long, drifting like a shadow behind Daniel's success, smiling politely at events, nodding at investors, supporting decisions she hadn't made. Now, she was alone. But alone wasn't the same as broken. Alone could also mean free. She sat at the modest table and opened her notebook, one that had remained untouched for years. Pages were filled with sketches, business plans, market ideas, and notes from when she had once dreamed of building something of her own. Before Daniel convinced her that her ideas were a hobby, not a venture. Before boardroom dinners and investor brunches swallowed her identity whole. Evelyn turned each page slowly, reliving the hunger she once had, the ambition that was silenced behind polished appearances and forced smiles. She circled one of the old concepts, a boutique consultancy firm aimed at restructuring outdated business models. She had written those words in a time when she believed she'd have a partner to build that dream with. Now, perhaps it was time to build it for herself. Her phone buzzed beside her, interrupting the moment. The name on the screen made her pause. Marcus Hale. She hadn't expected him to reply so quickly, let alone follow up with such determination. She answered on the third ring, her voice steady. "Yes." Marcus spoke with the same confident calm he always had. "There's something you need to see," he said. "I looked into the structural changes at Remington Holdings since Olivia's promotion. Some of it's cosmetic, but not all. You were right. Something deeper is shifting." Evelyn said nothing for a moment, then exhaled slowly. "I need to meet with you. In person." They met at a private co-working space downtown, a quiet venue tucked behind a florist and a pastry shop, the kind of place where no one asked too many questions. Marcus was already there when she arrived, reviewing documents on his tablet, a file folder neatly arranged beside him. Evelyn took a seat across from him, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. "I'm not here for revenge," she said without preamble. "I want clarity. I want to know what's being done to that company, and what's being risked because of it." Marcus nodded. "Understood. But if you're planning to go back—" "I'm not going back," she interrupted, her tone firm. "I'm moving forward." He slid the folder toward her. Inside were reports detailing Olivia's internal restructuring plans, asset reallocations, and a few confidential memos obtained from a source whose name he didn't disclose. Evelyn read in silence, her brows slowly knitting together. Some changes were brilliant, on paper. Others were reckless. Olivia was consolidating power too quickly, burning through layers of checks and balances. One document showed a proposal to outsource key departments to cheaper international subsidiaries. Cost-saving? Yes, but strategically risky. Another memo discussed possible layoffs in upper management. Evelyn saw names on that list. People who had been with the company for years, people she once considered allies. "She's playing chess," Evelyn murmured. but she's ignoring the long-term consequences. Daniel won't see it until it's too late. Marcus nodded. He doesn't want to. He's intoxicated by her momentum. He thinks it's vision. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. Then it's time someone shows him what vision really looks like. They talked for hours about market opportunities, untapped sectors, outdated models in Daniel's company that Olivia had failed to modernize. Evelyn proposed a bold move, partnering with a rival firm, not just as a consultant, but as a stakeholder. A way to build something real, something enduring, and a subtle way to challenge Daniel without ever needing to say his name. Marcus hesitated. That would be war, he said carefully. This isn't about personal conflict anymore, Evelyn replied. It's about business, about building something that can outlast them both. The next few days were a whirlwind. Evelyn immersed herself in planning, brushing the dust off her skills like they'd never been buried. She reconnected with contacts she hadn't spoken to in years, former colleagues, industry veterans, even past rivals. Some were surprised to hear from her, others delighted. But none of them questioned her capability. They had always known Evelyn as a sharp mind buried in Daniel's shadow. Now, they saw her stepping out of it. She visited the headquarters of Pierce & Callahan, a long-standing rival to Remington Holdings, known for its innovation and steady growth. The CEO, Walter Callahan, had always admired Evelyn's grace in negotiations, even if he'd never said it aloud. When she arrived in his office unannounced, he stood from his desk with visible curiosity. "You have my attention," he said. Evelyn shook his hand firmly. "Good," she replied, "because I have a proposal that could change the game." She presented her plan in detail: consulting division, internal training frameworks, brand rejuvenation, merger potential. Walter listened, intrigued, impressed. "You've clearly been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Years," Evelyn admitted. "But now, I have nothing holding me back." They didn't finalize anything that day, but by the time she walked out of that building, she knew a door had been opened, one she intended to walk through fully. That night, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror, wiping off her makeup slowly, the steam curling around her from the hot shower. She studied her own reflection, not the tired wife of a millionaire, not the background figure of boardroom events, but the woman who was finally building something of her own. A small smile crept across her lips. She wasn't done. She was just getting started. Across town, Daniel poured a glass of wine in the same living room where Evelyn once curled beside him. He stared out the window, feeling oddly unsettled, though he couldn't explain why. He hadn't spoken to Evelyn in days. Not a text, not a call. He assumed she was wallowing, perhaps packing things from the house, perhaps mourning her place in his world. But she wasn't. She was rising, quietly, deliberately. And Daniel, too drunk on his illusion of power, had no idea the foundation beneath him was already beginning to shift. The weeks that followed Olivia's official rise were a whirlwind of calculated changes and barely veiled power plays. The walls of Remington Holdings no longer echoed with the familiar rhythm of structure and tradition. It was a different rhythm now, one defined by efficiency, control, and a subtle but pervasive air of intimidation. Olivia had made it her mission not only to execute operations, but to redefine them. Slowly, methodically, she began to dismantle what Daniel had spent years building, not in overt destruction, but through quiet erosion. The company's longtime employees, those who had remained loyal through highs and lows, began to feel displaced, even if no one said it aloud. Meetings that once welcomed collaborative input turned into rigid briefings where decisions had already been made. Olivia no longer needed approval. She had authority, and she wielded it like a scalpel, precise, quiet, deadly. Daniel, at first, was pleased. He mistook her reorganization for innovation, her dismissals for necessary progress, her detachment for professionalism. He praised her in interviews, credited her with bringing a new vision to the firm, and dismissed concerns from colleagues who had grown uneasy. When the CFO, an old friend of Daniel's, and one of the few who dared to voice discomfort, expressed hesitation about Olivia's aggressive restructuring, Daniel waved it off. "We need to evolve," he said confidently. "People fear change. That doesn't mean it's the wrong move." But he didn't notice the way the CFO paused, silently choosing not to argue further. One by one, those who once stood at his side either resigned or were strategically moved out. Their replacements were younger, more malleable, often personally selected by Olivia from obscure circles that had little to do with Remington's legacy. Olivia wasn't just building a new structure. She was building loyalty to herself. Daniel began to spend more time out of his office, trusting Olivia with more decisions. His belief in her was unshakable, bordering on blind. He often returned to find things already in motion, projects approved, deals signed, partnerships initiated. He congratulated her for her initiative, unaware of how often those decisions excluded his oversight entirely. His own voice was becoming less and less relevant. But he didn't see it. He thought delegation was leadership. He thought control delegated to someone he trusted still counted as his own. Olivia's presence extended beyond the company walls. She subtly began occupying parts of Daniel's personal life. She hosted small gatherings at his home, inviting board members under the guise of casual networking. She took over scheduling his appointments, handled press relations, even selected his wardrobe for events. At first, Daniel found it flattering, a sign of her dedication. But something in the way she moved through his life, efficient, emotionless, ever-present, began to feel invasive. Still, he said nothing. He told himself this was the price of success, that this was what high-level trust looked like. Then came the first fracture he couldn't ignore. One afternoon, during a meeting with a major investor, Daniel referenced a project he believed was still in the planning phase. But the investor interrupted, confused. That project? Olivia already approved it. Contracts are signed. Didn't she tell you? Daniel froze for a moment, masking his surprise with a chuckle. Of course, I just hadn't seen the final brief. He covered the moment with his usual charm, but inside, a faint unease began to stir. After the meeting, he confronted Olivia privately. Why wasn't I updated on the Kensington project? She looked up from her laptop without hesitation. It moved faster than expected. I thought you'd appreciate not being bogged down with the details. He nodded slowly, but the words didn't sit right. He'd always been detail-oriented. Olivia knew that, yet she brushed it off like it was nothing. That night, he sat alone in his study, staring at the file. The project had implications, big ones. He realized decisions were being made without his voice, but instead of confronting the truth, he convinced himself it was a fluke. He still believed he was in control. He still believed Olivia was acting on his behalf. But the second fracture came sooner than he expected. A few days later, he noticed a shift in his own executive team's demeanor. The once informal conversations had grown colder. They hesitated before speaking, measured their words carefully, and avoided eye contact when discussing critical issues. It was as if they feared him, or rather, feared something else. He overheard snippets of conversation in hallways, whispers in elevators, expressions he couldn't decipher. Olivia, meanwhile, remained calm and unreadable. She attended every meeting, her notes always perfectly prepared, her responses polished. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was becoming an outsider in his own firm. Then the third fracture arrived, this time impossible to ignore. He received a notification that his access to several internal systems had been modified. When he confronted IT, they explained it was a security update, part of Olivia's ongoing digital restructuring initiative. He raised an eyebrow. Why wasn't I informed? The technician hesitated. We were told not to bother you with technical protocol. Miss Hart said it was covered. Something snapped in him. That night, he returned home unusually early, poured a glass of whiskey, and stood in silence. Evelyn's absence suddenly felt louder. She would have noticed these changes. She would have asked questions. But Evelyn was gone, and Olivia was everywhere. And still, Daniel clung to the idea that everything was fine. Meanwhile, Evelyn was laying the next brick in her quiet campaign. She met with Walter Callahan again, this time at a rooftop lounge with a view that rivaled Daniel's penthouse. They discussed market gaps, outlined partnership structures, and drafted a blueprint for strategic expansion. Evelyn wasn't just proposing a partnership. She was engineering a takeover plan that would destabilize Daniel's empire without a single blow being thrown. Walter admired her clarity. You're building this like a chess game, he said with a grin. Evelyn stirred her drink slowly. I'm just making sure I never sit on the sidelines again. Across the table, a young associate handed Evelyn a document, a list of potential allies within Remington Holdings. People disillusioned with Olivia's tactics. People who still respected Evelyn's legacy. Evelyn read the names in silence. One of them had been on the verge of resigning. Another had already reached out to a rival firm. Seeds of unrest were blooming, and she intended to nurture them carefully. Back at Remington, Olivia continued tightening her grip. She eliminated quarterly roundtables, suspended executive town halls, and replaced internal feedback systems with analytics-driven tools that masked sentiment. Her actions were all technically sound, supported by metrics and results. But beneath the numbers, morale was slipping. Daniel began to notice the small cracks, staff turning over faster, meetings less dynamic, innovation stagnating. But again, he told himself it was transition pains, nothing more. Until the fourth fracture. During a charity gala, Daniel gave a speech about Remington's future. But when the press release went live the next day, it was Olivia quoted in the headlines. The article titled her "The Strategic Heart Behind Remington's Growth." Daniel's name appeared only once, at the bottom. He asked her about it later, half joking. "Did you ghostwrite that release?" Olivia smiled coolly. "I submitted it through PR, yes. You were busy, and they needed something fast." He nodded, but something in him tightened again. Not anger, not suspicion, just an unfamiliar silence between thoughts. A hollow space where trust used to live. And still, he stayed silent. But Evelyn wasn't staying silent. She had already scheduled her third meeting with Walter. This time, it wouldn't be exploratory. This time, she was bringing numbers, projections, and a timeline. Because while Daniel believed he had everything, he was about to discover what betrayal really looked like. Not in rage, not in dramatic departure, but in the quiet unraveling of everything he thought was his. It began with a whisper, a casual remark from a former colleague during a quiet lunch meeting at a boutique hotel. Evelyn Remington sat in a corner booth, sunlight filtering through the linen curtains as the soft clinking of cutlery and murmured conversation filled the air. Her companion, Leonard Briggs, a former strategy director who had left Remington Holdings 2 years prior, leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You do realize Olivia isn't just climbing the ladder," he said. "She's redesigning the entire building." Evelyn didn't respond right away. She simply sipped her tea and stared at the people passing on the street beyond the glass. She already knew Olivia wasn't just managing the company. She was taking it apart piece by piece and rebuilding it in her own image. But hearing it from someone else confirmed what she had sensed from the moment Daniel signed those transfer papers. Power hadn't merely shifted, it had been hijacked. Leonard glanced at her with an expression that was part curiosity, part admiration. "So what's your move?" he asked. Evelyn placed her cup down gently. "I'm not interested in revenge," she said calmly. "I'm interested in justice. In balance. In showing Daniel that there's a difference between being needed and being remembered." Leonard nodded slowly. "And you think you can take her down from the outside?" Evelyn smiled faintly. "I don't need to take her down. I just need to build something better. And then let everyone else decide where they'd rather stand." Later that week, she met again with Walter Callahan. This time, she didn't bring ideas. She brought a plan. A complete breakdown of Remington Holdings' structural weaknesses, gaps in market positioning, and areas where Olivia's fast-track decisions could lead to operational collapse within the next year. Walter reviewed every page with clinical interest, occasionally raising an eyebrow or nodding at a particularly sharp observation. Evelyn had always been a strategist, but now she was something else entirely. Calculated, bold, unapologetically driven. When Walter finished, he set the folder aside and leaned forward. "You're proposing a full acquisition play," he said. "That's not subtle." Evelyn looked him straight in the eye. "Subtlety doesn't win wars. Precision does." He smiled slowly, already intrigued by the idea. "What's your role in all this?" She didn't flinch. "I want in. Not as a consultant. As a partner. I've spent too long building someone else's empire. It's time I build my own." And so, the wheels began to turn. Walter assigned his best analysts to run simulations. Evelyn coordinated meetings with silent investors. People who had remained neutral began expressing interest. Her reputation, quiet but formidable, carried weight. Old allies resurfaced, offering support not out of pity, but out of respect. Meanwhile, Evelyn kept her steps discreet. She didn't broadcast her moves. She simply acted. She knew the corporate world didn't reward noise, it rewarded outcomes. And she had no intention of revealing her hand until the timing was perfect. Back at Remington Holdings, the internal tension continued to escalate. Olivia had started streamlining operations aggressively. Entire departments were merged or cut. Employee satisfaction surveys vanished from circulation. Daniel noticed the decline in morale, but attributed it to the discomfort of progress. People always resist change, he told himself. But something about the silence in the office corridors, the lack of laughter, the absence of creative energy, began to bother him. He raised the issue with Olivia during a private dinner meeting. "We need to keep an eye on internal culture," he said. "We can't afford to lose the heart of this company." Olivia responded with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Sentiment doesn't drive revenue. Strategy does." Daniel nodded, but the words echoed uncomfortably in his mind long after the conversation ended. That same evening, Evelyn sat in a dimly lit conference room with Walter and 3 senior investors. She presented the acquisition proposal with calm authority, outlining the sequence of moves required to make it feasible within 6 months. The investors, initially skeptical, leaned in closer as she spoke. Every detail was accounted for: risk assessments, public relations strategy, transitional leadership planning. She wasn't just reacting to what had been taken from her. She was constructing something that would outlast them all. When she finished, one of the investors, a sharp-eyed woman named Claudia, leaned back in her chair and said, "This doesn't feel like a business proposal. It feels like a reckoning." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Perhaps it is." Over the following weeks, Evelyn split her time between finalizing the acquisition strategy and quietly reaching out to key personnel inside Remington Holdings. People who had once worked under her, who respected her, who were growing uneasy under Olivia's regime. Some responded cautiously, others with eagerness. She didn't ask them to leave immediately. She simply planted seeds. Seeds of doubt. Seeds of possibility. She knew how to speak without speaking directly. How to make someone feel empowered to choose what she had already designed for them to choose. It wasn't manipulation, it was influence. And Evelyn had mastered it long ago. At the same time, she started reconnecting with media contacts. Not to gossip or leak information, but to lay the groundwork. She gave interviews framed around leadership, the role of women in corporate innovation, and the importance of long-term vision over rapid scaling. She didn't mention Daniel or Olivia by name, but her words painted a contrast so stark that it became impossible for readers not to make the connection. Quietly, her public profile began to rise again. Quietly, people started to talk. Daniel, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. His board meetings felt different, more controlled, less interactive. He realized, slowly and painfully, that most updates were being filtered through Olivia, that some decisions were being finalized before they ever reached his desk. He told himself it was just an operational adjustment. But when he stumbled upon a proposal bearing his signature, one he had never signed, he knew something was wrong. He confronted Olivia in his office. "Who authorized this?" he demanded, holding up the document. Olivia didn't blink. It was an oversight. The legal team used an old signature template. "I'll fix it." Daniel stared at her, something shifting in his expression. "This isn't an oversight," he said. "It's a pattern." Olivia tilted her head. "Then maybe it's a pattern worth examining." He left that meeting feeling hollow, more unsure of his footing than ever before. He went home early that night, hoping for peace. But peace had long since abandoned his home. The mansion was too quiet, too large, too empty. He poured himself a drink and wandered the halls, thinking about the empire he had built and the woman he had pushed out. He thought about Evelyn, not with longing, but with curiosity. What was she doing now? Did she ever think about him? Did she still believe in the man he had once been? He pulled out an old photo album and flipped through pages he hadn't looked at in years. Pictures of them during the early days, before Remington Holdings became a titan. Her eyes in those pictures sparkled with belief, not just in him, but in their shared future. Now, that future was gone, and the silence left in its place was deafening. And still, he didn't see the full picture forming behind the curtain. Still, he believed he was the protagonist of his story. Still, he couldn't imagine that the woman he had discarded was now orchestrating something that would alter everything he believed he owned, everything he believed he controlled. He didn't see the final pieces falling into place, but he would soon. The morning sky hung over the Remington Holdings tower like a heavy curtain, gray and low, casting a somber tone across the mirrored facade. Inside, the office hummed with the familiar rhythm of productivity, but the atmosphere had subtly changed. The energy that once pulsed through the company's veins had become sluggish, strained beneath the surface. There was tension in every hallway conversation, in every exchange of glances during meetings. Olivia Hart, now the uncontested force within the company, walked the corridors with a brisk elegance that left little room for error or warmth. Her presence alone was enough to quiet conversations, straighten backs, and instill caution in seasoned professionals who had once navigated these floors with confidence. She had become both the symbol and the architect of this new order, and everyone knew it. Daniel Remington, though still technically CEO, was beginning to feel the slow erosion of his authority. At first, he chalked it up to transition fatigue. New leadership always brought friction, but friction was supposed to settle, not sharpen. And lately, he had begun to notice more than just discomfort. He had begun to notice disconnection. His calendar was filled with meetings he hadn't scheduled, some with clients he barely remembered, others with internal teams he no longer recognized. Reports arrived at his desk already signed and sealed. Financial reviews bypassed his office altogether. Olivia claimed it was efficiency, streamlining, simplification of internal processes. But to Daniel, it was starting to feel like omission. He tried to reassert his presence, dropping in on department meetings unannounced, requesting direct updates from team leads, reintroducing himself to junior staff. But the reactions he encountered were unsettling. Nervous smiles, hesitant tones, blank expressions that seemed to say, "Why are you here?" Even his longtime executive assistant, who had once greeted him with warmth and familiarity, now addressed him with clipped professionalism, as if trying not to attract attention from higher up. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it gnawed at him. Then came the missed acquisition, a mid-sized tech firm, one Daniel had been courting quietly for months, suddenly pulled out of negotiations without explanation. He discovered through an external contact that the firm had received a warning about internal instability within Remington Holdings. When he confronted Olivia, she didn't deny it. They asked questions about leadership continuity, she said coolly. I answered honestly. You've been less visible lately. Investors noticed that. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. You're undermining me in front of potential partners. Olivia didn't blink. I'm protecting the company's reputation. If that's perceived as undermining you, perhaps we need to rethink how leadership appears externally. The conversation ended with Daniel storming out of the room, but something deeper than anger simmered beneath his frustration, an unshakable suspicion that his company was no longer his. Still, he tried to salvage the situation. He scheduled a town hall meeting, determined to address the staff directly and re-establish his presence. But when the day came, only half the company attended. Olivia claimed scheduling conflicts, department priorities, last-minute emergencies. The remaining audience sat stiffly, their reactions lukewarm, their eyes scanning the room more often than the stage. Daniel delivered his speech with forced conviction, emphasizing vision, unity, legacy, but the words felt hollow, even to him. Afterward, in the privacy of his office, he slumped into his chair and stared out at the skyline. He thought of Evelyn, not with nostalgia, but with reluctant clarity. She would have seen this coming. She would have warned him. She always did. But he had chosen to ignore her insights, dismiss her instincts, cast her aside like an outdated relic of his early career. And now, everything she had once tried to preserve was slipping through his fingers. Back in her modest office across town, Evelyn was watching the ripple effect of her groundwork take form. Reports from internal sources confirmed what she had anticipated. Morale was low, communication fractured, and key team members were either leaving or disengaging. Her network inside Remington Holdings was growing stronger, each message she received reinforcing the cracks in Daniel's empire. She kept her tone measured in every exchange, never overtly critical, always positioning herself as an alternative rather than an adversary. She didn't need to attack. She just needed to offer something better. Walter Callahan had accelerated their timeline. The acquisition proposal was almost finalized, and the investors were more eager than ever. The plan was simple but powerful. Target Remington's weak points, departments strained under poor leadership, market gaps left unaddressed, and dissatisfied personnel, and present an offer that seemed less like a takeover and more like a rescue. Evelyn worked tirelessly to ensure every detail was aligned. Her mind was sharp, her focus unwavering. She didn't dwell on what she had lost. She concentrated only on what she was about to gain. Meanwhile, Daniel's confidence began to erode further. Another blow came when an internal audit revealed irregularities in one of the international subsidiaries, a division Olivia had pushed to expand rapidly without proper oversight. The losses weren't catastrophic, but they were embarrassing. He brought it up during a board meeting, expecting support, expecting someone to question Olivia's judgment. But the room remained quiet. The board members exchanged glances, but said nothing. Olivia addressed the issue herself, downplaying it as a growing pain and outlining a recovery plan. The board nodded, satisfied. Daniel felt invisible. Later that day, he called his legal counsel to inquire about executive authority limitations. He wanted to know if it was possible to reassume direct control, to reverse some of the operational changes Olivia had implemented. The answer he received left him stunned. Technically, she holds full operational power. You signed the delegation agreement yourself, Daniel. You're still CEO, yes, but she's the one steering the ship. If you want to undo that, you'd need board approval. And frankly, I'm not sure you'd get it. The weight of those words sat on his shoulders like a stone. He had built an empire with his own hands and then handed the keys to someone who now saw him as little more than a figurehead. He walked through the corridors that afternoon with a heaviness he couldn't hide, observing the employees who used to greet him with admiration now avert their eyes. He wasn't feared. He wasn't respected. He was tolerated, and only because of the title on his business card. At home, the silence grew unbearable. Olivia had started sending messages even there, controlling his schedule through shared calendars, forwarding press inquiries, making executive decisions from the comfort of her own apartment. She no longer waited for permission. She assumed command. And Daniel, once the emblem of power, found himself reacting instead of directing, responding instead of deciding, watching instead of leading. And Evelyn, far removed from the tower where her legacy had once been buried, stood on the edge of something greater. She wasn't just rebuilding herself. She was preparing to take back the ground she had lost, and more. She stood one evening in front of a whiteboard filled with flowcharts and financial models, reviewing the final stages of the plan. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who had walked through fire and emerged not burned, but forged. In a few weeks, the offer would be made public. In a few weeks, Daniel would be faced with a choice: fight against a storm he couldn't control or watch everything slip quietly through his grasp. And when that moment came, Evelyn wouldn't need revenge. She would have something far more powerful. She would have purpose. And Daniel, he would have nothing but regret. The days had grown colder, both in weather and in atmosphere, though Daniel couldn't tell which one pressed harder on his chest. The wind outside the glass walls of his penthouse sliced through the city like a scalpel, but it was the chill inside his home that truly unsettled him. The silence had become unbearable, an oppressive presence that lingered in every room he walked through. He had once found solace in solitude, moments when the noise of the world faded, and all that remained was his own quiet supremacy. But this was different. This silence didn't feel like peace. It felt like abandonment. It felt like being left behind by a life he thought he still owned. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at a reflection he could no longer recognize. The man who had once embodied control and confidence now looked worn, unsure. The crispness of his tailored suit couldn't hide the tension in his shoulders or the weariness in his eyes. His hair, once neatly styled with purpose, now sat slightly tousled, as if even his appearance was beginning to fray along with everything else. He ran a hand along his jawline and leaned in closer, studying the lines etched along his forehead, lines that hadn't been there just months ago. Lines Evelyn used to smooth with her fingers after long days. His chest tightened at the thought, and he stepped back abruptly, as if trying to escape the image of himself. He hadn't spoken to Evelyn in weeks. Not since she'd left without a fight, without a dramatic confrontation, without tears. Her departure had been quiet, almost surgical, and yet it echoed more loudly than any argument ever could. He had expected her to call eventually, to plead, to question, to try and reclaim some piece of their life together. But she hadn't, and that silence haunted him more than anything else. At work, things continued to slide out of his hands. Olivia had introduced a new set of directives that effectively centralized all decision-making through her office. Daniel had tried to resist, to push back, to reclaim the authority he believed still belonged to him. But his attempts were met with red tape, board resistance, and Olivia's ever-polite explanations that disguised deeper intentions. "You delegated authority," she'd remind him with a smile. "You trusted me to lead. That's what I'm doing." And though he wanted to argue, to tear that smile off her face and demand his company back, he knew the truth. He had handed her the power willingly. He had made his own prison, and now he was pacing inside it. His staff spoke to him less and less. The departments that once reported directly to him now funneled information to Olivia. Clients referred to her in meetings as if she were the CEO. Daniel often found himself sitting in his own office, reading summaries of meetings he hadn't been invited to, watching the world he created move without him. He wasn't steering anymore. He was a passenger. And worse, he was a passenger in a car he once owned, now being driven by someone else, to destinations he didn't choose. The board began raising subtle concerns, not about Olivia's leadership, but about his own detachment. "You seem distant," one member had remarked during a quarterly meeting. "Maybe it's time to consider a more ceremonial role. Chairman Emeritus, perhaps. You'd still retain influence, but the day-to-day decisions." Daniel hadn't let him finish. He'd stood, said something dismissive, and walked out. But the seed had been planted. They were already imagining his exit. They were already preparing for life without him. One evening, after a particularly grueling board review session, Daniel sat in his penthouse with a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out at the city skyline. The lights, once symbols of his ambition, now felt like distant stars, unreachable, indifferent. He thought about Olivia's trajectory, how quickly she had climbed, how seamlessly she had woven herself into the fabric of everything he once controlled. He thought about the confidence she carried, the way she maneuvered people, the ease with which she had replaced not just Evelyn, but every structure Evelyn had once supported. And he thought about Evelyn, not with resentment or longing, but with something heavier. Regret. Regret for dismissing her counsel, for discarding her presence, for choosing something new and glittering over something steady and loyal. He remembered the way she used to notice things no one else did. The subtle tension in a deal. The shift in a partner's demeanor. The timing of a move that seemed too convenient. He had called it overthinking. She had called it instinct. And now, as everything unraveled around him, he saw clearly that it had always been insight. The next day, he found himself driving aimlessly after leaving the office early. He didn't know where he was going until he arrived. An old cafe on the edge of the city, one they used to visit before things got too big, too complicated, too corporate. He sat in the corner booth, the same one they used to sit in, and ordered coffee. He scanned the room, expecting to see ghosts, but all he found was emptiness. He looked down at his phone and opened a photo, one of him and Evelyn on a beach vacation years ago. He studied the way she looked at him in that image, with warmth and trust, and it hit him like a blow to the chest. He had once been that man. Now, he wasn't sure who he had become. Meanwhile, across the city, Evelyn was finalizing the last steps of the acquisition plan with Walter. They were days away from presenting the offer publicly. The documents were ready. The investors aligned. The strategy airtight. She had thought this moment would bring satisfaction, even triumph. But what she felt most was clarity. A quiet resolve that she was no longer chasing what had been lost, but building what would come next. Walter handed her a final report, his expression thoughtful. "When this goes public, he won't see it coming." Evelyn nodded, not with malice, but with certainty. "He doesn't see much these days," she said quietly. "Not because he can't, because he doesn't want to." That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, plagued by a sense that something was closing in. He couldn't explain it, just a gnawing sense of impending consequence. He sat up, ran a hand through his hair, and walked into his office. He stared at the city again, searching for answers, for something to ground him. But all he saw was the reflection of a man who had traded wisdom for arrogance, loyalty for novelty, and legacy for illusion. And just beyond that glass, the storm Evelyn had orchestrated was about to begin. Monday morning arrived with an eerie calm, the kind that hides chaos beneath its stillness. Daniel stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with mechanical precision, unaware that this would be the day everything would shift. Outside, the sky was overcast, casting a muted light over the city skyline, and inside, he moved through the motions of routine. Coffee, phone check, schedule review, believing, naively, that this would be just another day in his meticulously crafted world. The storm was already brewing, though, quietly, efficiently, orchestrated with the kind of patience only those who've known deep betrayal could master. At that very hour, in another building across town, Evelyn stood beside Walter Callahan in the glass-walled boardroom of Callahan Ventures, a place that now bore the weight of strategy, ambition, and the final steps toward a meticulously executed takeover. Dressed in a deep navy suit, she looked every bit the figure of authority, confidence radiating from her without the need for theatrics or force. Walter leaned toward her slightly, speaking in low tones. "Our legal team just got confirmation. The acquisition proposal has been delivered. They'll receive it within the next hour." Evelyn didn't smile. She simply nodded once. "Then let's begin." Back at Remington Holdings, Olivia arrived earlier than usual. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished marble floors, and her assistant followed closely behind, clutching a portfolio of the day's agenda. She moved through the building like she owned it, because in many ways, she did. Employees stood a little straighter as she passed. Department heads glanced nervously at their notes. The staff had grown used to her presence, but that didn't mean they had grown comfortable. Olivia operated like a machine, efficient, cold, commanding. She entered the executive conference room without a word, placing her leather folder on the long glass table and preparing for what she believed would be another day of strategic execution. But she hadn't seen the emails yet. She hadn't seen the documents. She hadn't felt the shift in the air that had already begun, quietly, before a single word was spoken. Daniel was in his office reviewing a market projection report when his phone buzzed sharply. It wasn't a calendar alert or a staff message. It was a call from the legal department, urgent. He answered immediately, his voice low. "Remington. Mr. Remington." The voice on the other end said, already strained with tension. "We just received a formal acquisition proposal from Callahan Ventures. It's comprehensive. They've made a bid for a controlling stake." Daniel's hand froze on his pen. He blinked slowly. "What? Sir, you need to come down to the conference room. Now." He didn't speak. He just stood, as if the words hadn't quite landed. Controlling stake. Callahan Ventures. Acquisition. None of it made sense. He grabbed his jacket and strode down the hallway, his footsteps echoing like a ticking clock. When he entered the executive conference room, a dozen faces turned toward him, legal counsel, board members, financial analysts, all wearing variations of disbelief and confusion. Olivia was already seated, flipping through the proposal packet with a furrowed brow, her usually unreadable expression beginning to fray. Daniel approached the table, took a packet, and began to read. The logo at the top was unmistakable, Callahan Ventures. But what caught his attention wasn't the numbers, the structure, or even the aggressive timeline. It was the signature at the bottom of the cover letter. Evelyn Remington. His stomach dropped. He read it again, as if the ink might have changed in the last few seconds. But it was there, her name, in elegant script, beneath the title of partner and executive strategist. He looked up, eyes scanning the room. No one spoke. No one needed to. The truth was written on every page. Evelyn hadn't disappeared. She hadn't mourned or retreated. She had been building, planning, executing. And now she stood at the center of a power play that would make headlines, turn boardrooms inside out, and leave him with nothing but disbelief and regret. The board erupted into quiet chaos, questions flying, concerns raised, phones buzzing with incoming press inquiries. Olivia tried to take control of the conversation, citing contingencies and counterproposals, but her voice lacked the iron certainty she once commanded. Daniel stood silent, packet in hand, his mind racing. He couldn't hear the words around him. All he could see was Evelyn's name. All he could feel was the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. Every dismissal, every time he had chosen novelty over loyalty, control over collaboration, arrogance over intuition. It was all written in ink now, staring him in the face. The following hours moved like a blur. Emergency meetings were scheduled. PR teams scrambled. Analysts ran projections on the implications of the acquisition. And through it all, Daniel moved like a man underwater, struggling to breathe beneath the weight of his own downfall. He replayed conversations with Evelyn in his mind, warnings he had ignored, insights he had dismissed, the last look she gave him before she walked away. He remembered her words, quiet but firm. "You'll see the cost later." And now, here it was, calculated in percentages, dissected in clauses, and signed by the woman he had underestimated. Later that afternoon, Daniel received another email. A request from Callahan Ventures for an in-person meeting to discuss transition terms. Attached to the request was a list of attendees. Evelyn's name was at the top. He read it twice before closing his laptop. His office felt colder than it had ever felt before. At the same time, Evelyn walked into the lobby of Remington Holdings for the first time since she had left. The receptionist looked up, startled, unsure how to react. She offered no explanation, just a polite nod as she stepped into the elevator, flanked by Walter Callahan and two legal advisors. The elevator rose slowly, and Evelyn watched her reflection in the mirrored walls. She didn't feel nervous. She didn't feel vengeful. She felt certain. This was no longer about what Daniel had taken. It was about what she had reclaimed. When the elevator doors opened, the staff stared in stunned silence. Olivia stood in the hallway, frozen mid-step, her eyes locking with Evelyn's for a long, still moment. Daniel emerged from his office seconds later, stopping short at the sight. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Evelyn stepped forward, calm and poised. "We're here for the meeting," she said simply. And just like that, the past returned, not as a ghost, not as a plea, but as a force that would change everything. The conference room had never felt so quiet. Not even during the darkest financial crises or the most high-stakes negotiations had Daniel experienced this particular kind of silence, the kind that made every breath feel loud, every movement feel exposed. The door had barely closed behind Evelyn and her team, yet her presence already filled the space with authority, commanding more respect in a single glance than Olivia had achieved with months of control. Daniel remained standing near the end of the long glass table, still gripping the acquisition proposal like it might change in his hands if he stared at it long enough. But nothing changed. Nothing would. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding his eyes altogether, others watching Evelyn with an unmistakable mix of admiration and curiosity. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to assert her position with grand gestures. She had already won the room without speaking a single word. Olivia, seated across the table, tried to maintain her usual composure. Her fingers twitched slightly against the leather portfolio she had brought, and her jaw remained clenched just tightly enough to reveal the effort it took to hold back frustration. She had not anticipated this. She had accounted for risks, projected competitor movements, strategized against internal dissent, but nowhere in her plans had she imagined Evelyn returning not as the discarded wife of the former CEO, but as the strategic partner behind a rival acquisition. It wasn't just disruptive, it was humiliating. A cold flush of realization crept across her skin. This wasn't her victory lap. This was her reckoning. Daniel finally cleared his throat, breaking the heavy stillness. "We'll review the proposal in detail before offering a formal response," he said, directing the statement to Evelyn and Walter with forced steadiness. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She simply nodded, then slid a separate folder across the table toward the board. "We anticipated that," she replied, her tone calm, almost serene. "You'll find preliminary transition plans, including suggested leadership integration strategies and partnership terms. Everything has been designed to minimize disruption, unless, of course, you prefer a public bidding war." The room went even quieter. The threat was subtle, but it was there. She wasn't just taking back power. She was offering a choice: cooperate or collapse. After the meeting adjourned, Daniel returned to his office, but it no longer felt like his office. Every object, every photograph, every file now seemed tainted by the knowledge that the walls were closing in. He paced for hours, unable to sit, unable to focus. He tried calling in favors, contacts, shareholders, longtime allies, but each conversation ended the same way: polite sympathy, guarded responses, and a quiet undertone of finality. The tide had shifted, and he could feel it dragging him out to sea. Meanwhile, Olivia began to retreat into her own spiral of damage control. She summoned her staff for an emergency meeting, snapping at assistants and issuing orders with increasing desperation. But the veneer of control was cracking. People no longer responded with urgency. They responded with calculation, with hesitation, with the kind of cautious deference reserved for sinking ships. She realized, too late, that her power had always been tethered to Daniel's status. Without it, she was just another executive with sharp instincts and no ground to stand on. And Evelyn had already built a platform twice as solid beneath her feet. Over the next several days, the cracks in Daniel's empire widened. Media outlets caught wind of the proposed acquisition and began publishing speculative articles with provocative headlines. Callahan Ventures eyes Remington Holdings in surprise takeover move, power shift in the corporate world. Evelyn Remington returns, CEO or spectator. Daniel Remington's future uncertain. The press didn't need confirmation. The mere scent of a story was enough to spark wildfire coverage. Investors began asking questions Daniel couldn't answer. Internal staff grew more tense with each passing day. Departments began hesitating before executing directives. Olivia tried to rally support, but her influence was waning fast. People who once feared her now distanced themselves quietly, subtly, instinctively preserving their own careers. Then came the final blow. During a special board session, one of the longest-serving members cleared his throat and addressed Daniel directly. "We've reviewed the transition strategy offered by Callahan Ventures," he began, his voice solemn. "And considering the current market conditions, the instability we've seen internally, and the projected benefits, the board believes it is in the company's best interest to proceed with the acquisition." Daniel's chest tightened. He looked around the room, searching for some flicker of support, but found only lowered eyes and silent nods. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice low, brittle. "This is my company." The board member sighed. It was. But companies evolve, and sometimes leadership must evolve with them. He didn't respond. He couldn't. The words hung in the air like a guillotine, slow and final. He stood, not out of dignity, but because sitting any longer would have broken him entirely. He walked out of the boardroom without another word. No one stopped him. No one followed. That evening, he sat alone in his office for what he knew might be the last time. The city below still moved, oblivious to his collapse. He poured himself a drink, but it tasted bitter. He looked around at the room he had once ruled from, now nothing more than a cage he'd built brick by brick with his own decisions. His eyes fell on a single envelope left on his desk, marked only with his name. He opened it slowly, unfolding the neatly handwritten letter inside. It was from Evelyn. "There's no satisfaction in watching you fall, Daniel. I didn't build this to destroy you. I built it because you forgot what power really means. You forgot that loyalty is strength, not weakness. That partnership is not submission, and that success built on arrogance crumbles faster than anything else. This wasn't revenge. It was restoration. And maybe now, you'll finally see what you lost. Not just me, but everything I carried with me." He sat for a long time after reading those words, staring at the paper, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of regret not as a concept, but as a physical presence. Heavy, unrelenting, suffocating. He realized then that he hadn't just lost a company. He had lost his compass, his foundation, the person who had always been the true architect behind his success. The next day, he returned to the office to finalize the transfer documents. The process was sterile, procedural, hollow. Signatures, handshakes, protocol. When it was over, he stood in the lobby of his own company, watching employees pass by, none stopping to greet him, none acknowledging his presence. He was invisible in the empire he once ruled. And Evelyn, somewhere far above, was stepping into her new office, surrounded by respect, vision, and the legacy he had never bothered to preserve. He stepped outside into the cold, wind biting at his face, and realized that for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to protect him from it. Daniel sat in the center of his vast penthouse, surrounded by marble walls, designer furnishings, and priceless art that no longer seemed to carry meaning. The stillness was unbearable, broken only by the faint hum of the city far below. He leaned back on the leather couch, a crystal tumbler in his hand, the scotch inside untouched, its scent now nauseating instead of comforting. There was no music, no conversation, no noise of life. Just the echo of what used to be, a life filled with movement, decision, recognition, power. Now, the silence was louder than applause had ever been. And in that silence, Daniel was left to face himself, stripped of illusion, stripped of position, stripped of everything he thought made him important. He had watched it all fall apart, day by day, meeting by meeting, signature by signature. The company, once the centerpiece of his identity, now belonged to others. The assistant he had trusted, elevated, empowered beyond measure, had vanished without a goodbye, without a glance back. Olivia had disappeared the moment the board signed the transition agreement. Her office was cleared overnight. No note, no farewell, just absence. She had leveraged his empire for her own rise and discarded him when the structure no longer served her purpose. In the end, she hadn't betrayed him with a knife, but with silence and efficiency, cold, surgical, final. He had called her phone only once after the transfer was complete. The line rang, then went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. There was nothing left to say. He had wanted to believe she was loyal, that she respected him, that she saw in him a mentor, a partner. But loyalty was something he had misunderstood all along. He had thought it came from admiration. He had never considered it came from shared values, mutual respect, or genuine connection. And the only person who had ever given him that kind of loyalty was Evelyn. The woman he had pushed aside, belittled, underestimated. The woman who had walked away with dignity while he indulged in his illusion of superiority. He stared across the room, eyes landing on a framed photo that somehow survived the purge. One from years ago, a candid picture of him and Evelyn laughing in a vineyard during a business retreat. He had forgotten it was there. She looked radiant, carefree, grounded. He looked younger, sharper, but now all he could see was the arrogance behind his eyes. He got up slowly, walked toward the shelf, picked up the frame, and held it for a long time. He tried to remember what he had said that made her laugh like that. He couldn't. The following days were a blur of routines without purpose. He still dressed each morning out of habit, still read the news, still checked emails, though none of them mattered anymore. He received invites to charity events, business panels, networking galas, but none of them carried weight. Not now. Not with his name no longer attached to power. He declined each invitation, each one a reminder that his relevance had been tied to a position he no longer held. His phone stopped ringing after a while. The silence returned, heavier each time. One afternoon, while walking through the city, he passed by a newsstand and caught sight of a magazine cover. Evelyn stood on it, poised, powerful, her eyes calm and resolute. The headline read, "The Strategist Who Redefined Corporate Leadership." He stood still for several seconds, watching people walk by, none of them recognizing him, none of them slowing to take notice. He was invisible. He bought the magazine and returned home, reading the article in full. It detailed her rise post-acquisition, her visionary strategies, her role in expanding Callahan Ventures, her commitment to ethical leadership and sustainable growth. The writer described her as someone who had been overlooked for years, only to emerge as one of the most respected minds in the industry. Daniel couldn't argue with a word of it. He saw now what he had ignored for years. She had always been the heart of his empire. He had just been too blind to see it. That night, he wrote her a letter. Not to send, just to write. He poured out everything. His pride, his mistakes, his blindness, his regret. He wrote about how he had thought power came from control, when in truth, it came from trust. He confessed that he had only seen his reflection through the eyes of admiration, never through the eyes of consequence. He folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and left it on his desk. He didn't know if he'd ever send it. Maybe she wouldn't read it. Maybe she wouldn't care. But he needed to write it anyway. One morning, weeks later, he received an unexpected package. No return address. Inside was a single book, an old leadership classic Evelyn used to reference often. Tucked inside was a small note in her handwriting. "It's never too late to learn. It's only too late to pretend you didn't need to." He read it twice. No signature. No invitation for conversation. Just closure. And a subtle reminder that redemption wasn't owed, it was earned. That day, he left the penthouse for a walk. But this time he didn't wear his tailored suit. He dressed plainly, left his watch on the table, walked without a plan. For the first time in years, he didn't walk like a man who owned the city. He walked like a man who was trying to understand it again. The wind was sharp, but it felt cleaner somehow, as if he had finally stepped outside the storm he had built around himself. There were no crowds waiting, no cameras flashing, no assistants trailing behind him. Just Daniel, walking through the city like a man starting over, not from success, but from humility. He wasn't sure what came next. He didn't have a new plan, a new company, or a new title. But he had something he hadn't had in a long time: perspective. A small, quiet awareness that maybe power wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or having the highest seat at the table. Maybe it was about knowing when to let go, when to listen, when to change. He stood at the edge of the park, watching children play, couples walk by, joggers pass in rhythm. Life moved on, indifferent to his failures, unbothered by his fall. And maybe that was the final lesson. That power, prestige, control, none of it mattered if it wasn't rooted in something real, something honest, something lasting. As the wind rustled through the trees, Daniel turned toward home, his steps slower, but lighter. He carried nothing in his hands, no portfolio, no plan, no shield, just regret, and, perhaps, the first seeds of something new.